discipline, random notes to the speech teacher. And I got to thinking, how is it that we came from there to having something called interpersonal? And then last year in the book, almost every paper in the interpersonal or interest group was on something to do with personal relationships and families. And how do we go from the early roots of interpersonal to such a central focus on personal relationships? And I didn't know the answer. And so I thought, wouldn't it be great to get a panel together and begin to answer some of those questions? And then because this conference theme was looking forward and looking back, wouldn't it be nice to then connect that up to what are some of the next steps? And I believe some of the next steps are to more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research. And so I think that this panel that I'm very excited about, because the panel I envisioned didn't have such distinguished scholars as this. So I feel very fortunate that this ended up. So if you can't tell, this is going to be very exciting. So we'll go ahead and start off with the panel. Sandra Petronio from the University, or actually from Arizona State University, excuse me, is going to speak first on the orders of relating, a historical basis, and future hopes of relationships within interpersonal communication.
I'd like to thank John for putting this together. It's, I think, going to be an interesting panel with lots of good information. The history of interpersonal communication really has not actually been in the forefront of our discussions in the discipline of communication. Yet, really, to understand why we have embraced the idea of personal relationships so extensively and to develop plans for our future, we must travel to our beginnings. In our discipline, we have the privilege of both a rhetorical and a scientific origin. However, the scientific path marks the development of interpersonal communication. 7 areas contribute to its evolution. The dominant themes are found before 1970. The time frame is used here because after 1970 and to date, the area of interpersonal communication is really considered, and was considered, a vital area of inquiry in the discipline. These themes that form the historical basis include the scientific examination of public speaking, the scientific research on persuasion, speech psychology, the scientific examination of attitude, source credibility, and message systems. Now, as early as 1915, scholars in public speaking were arguing that expression was a viable form of communication. And by this, the likes of Wolbert in 1915 and Gaylord in 1916 pointed out that the purpose of studying oral expression was to give people an understanding of the living speech, that is, living speech that was adequate for ordinary intercourse and capable of expressing the thoughts and emotions of men and women as they conducted their relationships. People like Newcomb in 1917 suggested that expression is the mode of self-realization. Thus, self-expression in everyday life was considered an important concern for these early scholars. From the scientific research on public speaking as the humanistic or the rhetorical perspective, 3 concerns developed that really set the groundwork for our current interests in personal relationships. First, although other factors contributed to the area of nonverbal communication, such as the elocutionists, which are not often attributed, some of the early research on expression emphasized communicative elements of facial and body movements in addition to verbal utterances. And second, oral expression, and a subset of expression, was instrumental in piquing interest in relational interactions in everyday life. And third, emphasis on the individual that is found in early research on public speaking continues to be a theme in the general area of interpersonal communication. Through those different aspects, we find the important contributions of scientific inquiry in public speaking. The second trend, the scientific investigation of persuasion, really has the longest duration of interest in interpersonal communication today, in emphasizing the core assumption that the frame that frames current studies of personal relationships will evolution of persuasion research, including branches that emphasize compliance, meaning, and social influence, the topic remains a mainstay in interpersonal communication today. In the early 1900s, we find the beginning of the third trend. The psychology of speech has played an intimate yet significant part in our history. There were early attempts to use psychological theories to explain speech. The speech that is considered is largely, or can be considered interpersonal in nature, or interpersonal interactions between individuals. For example, Gray's 1928 article assesses the impact of Gestalt psychology on the way people speak to each other. His article on behavioristic interpretations of language in 1935 frames the way behaviorism plays a role in the speech act. And of course, today we see the blending of research and theory around the common theme of relating, where scholars draw not only from psychology, but many other fields as well. Yet, the early foray into judging the utility of research in other disciplines, like psychology, opened the doors in interpersonal communication, being receptive to interdisciplinary research. The scientific examination of attitudes began to appear in the journals in the 1930s. There was a focus on measurement to determine the influence of perceptions. For example, Franklin Noer's research on speech attitudes. The jump really was very short from considering changes in speech attitudes to those that are found in small group behavior and interpersonal interactions. In the 1960s, routinely we find emphasis of persuasion in our journals. Now, the scientific study of source credibility, or ethos, has played an important role in framing some of the focus for interpersonal communication as well. Although this area only began to appear in the 1940s, its proliferation after that date was significant to the study of interpersonal communication. Now, many may consider the idea of source credibility most important to public speaking. However, several of the early scholars understood the importance to personal relationships. For example, early researchers argued that believing individuals who are trust in their credibility has an impact on their perceptions, their ability to persuade, and their ability to deceive. Scientific examination of message systems in the last of the early themes framed interpersonal communication as well. In the early 1960s, articles began to appear that reflected a growing emphasis on speech patterns, sentence structures, and messages as focus. Issues such as the effect of anxiety-arousing messages related to immediate recall of differences between familial and interpersonal reference, and the verbal behavior of dialects were all examined in this early research. The articles may be seen as an early expedition into information processing, discourse, conversational analysis, and investigating the speech act, all of which are evident in today's exploration of personal relationships. As these themes portray the early history of interpersonal communication, carved out areas that lay the basis for scientific research in person-to-person interactions. However, it wasn't until 1948 that Frank Rehrig contended that the next advancement in the study of speech was to focus on inter-personal relations. The term was not widely used until the 1970s. As interpersonal communication became a legitimate area of study, there were a number of articles that outlined the nature then of the topic of inter-personal relationships. For example, Gerald Miller in 1975 posed the conceptualization that many of you I'm sure are familiar with, distinguishing between non-interpersonal and interpersonal, and using the issues of tradition why it is we're looking at interpersonal relationships and personal relationships today in our field. Through these discussions, we see the beginning emphasis of personal relationships and the associated communication routines that are found among individuals in relationships. Personal relationships tended to grow up being more attractive to people because it gave a context in which to study these kinds of issues. As we see, and we'll see here today on the panel, many scholars advance these ideas in the context of personal relationships, thereby identifying a clear identity for interpersonal communication to function in the future. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll have Steve Doctor from the University of Iowa. We'll talk about how relationships became central, with no disrespect to Southern.
Well, this is, I mean, it's almost as if we've arranged this because Sandra went up to 1975 and talked about Gerald Miller. I'm going to start in 1976 with a chapter that Gerald Miller wrote, where he introduced a book and collected a set of papers about interpersonal communication and relationships, which he claimed was either the first or the fifth book ever to do that. And he looked at the origin of our interest in interpersonal relationships from a communication point of view, and he analysed various trends that he saw in the field at the time that had caused it to come to the point that it was at, and gave it some momentum for the future. And I'm going to build on that a little bit because a lot of his points are really still applicable, even though he was talking in a different kind of context. He noted that our conceptualization of relationships in 1976 was rather underdeveloped, and not much has changed in the last 25 years, one might say. But we noted that anyone who shows an interest in relationships is showing an interest in essentially everyday discourse, as opposed to public address, legal argument, and so forth. And therefore is focused primarily on face-to-face settings that are punctuated. And those seem to me to be emphases which are present today, an emphasis on and interest in everyday life, punctuated and face-to-face settings. He also noted that in 1976, the Times themselves had created some of the ethos for studying relationships, in that there had been a marked emphasis away from public issues and more towards private interactions, away from encounter groups and touchy-feely stuff, and more towards an understanding of the pairings of individual peoples and what they did in their private lives. Well, private up to that point. And then along came people who wanted to do lots of studies on self-disclosure and study their intimate interactions and ask them questions about their private lives so they wouldn't stay private forever. But the emphasis in those days, in 1976, was very much on emphasizing the role which better communication played in relationship growth and relationship development. And he also noted that much research in social psychology at the time was emphasizing intra-individual factors and focusing on perception of other people or attraction towards other people based on your assessment of them, not much the interaction of those two people, but your judgments of the other person. He basically thought that the trend that was going to develop, which has turned out to be a very accurate prediction, is towards the qualitative shifts that take place as relationships developed, which was certainly one of the trends that took off from those times, although we've gone a little bit further than that. One of the things that he emphasized as being important was a strong emphasis in some of the work which was in that volume, particularly by Altman, on mutuality and the interaction of people involved in relationships. And he predicted quite correctly that people would pay less attention to interpersonal attraction, which is where all the emphasis was in the 70s, or most of the emphasis, and more towards ongoing relationships and continuing relationships and enhancements and management and other issues to do with things that went on during the course of a relationship rather than just the beginning. And he ended his forward with the observation that understanding the interpersonal communication processes demands an understanding of the symbiotic relationships between communication and relationship development. Communication influences relationship development, and in turn, or simultaneously, relationship development influences the nature of communication between partners, which was a very good summary of the situation and a very far-sighted one in terms of the way that people have developed this work. I think that we've probably broadened our conceptualization of relationships beyond some of the things that Miller saw, but consistent with it, in that now we're interested not only in the development and the maintenance of relationships, but also the decline, the dark side of relationships, the way in which they take place in different settings and different places, whether it's the task environment or the broader culture in which they're situated, or the community that they occur in, or the networks to which they are connected, recognizing that pairs of people are not only related to one another, but related to a whole bunch of other people who have the moral right to make accounts about what's going on in that situation and to comment on the conduct of relationships. And therefore, the relationship communication that takes place is not only interpersonal between the two people in the relationship, but with people in the broader network too. And one of the most interesting book proposals that I've seen in the last few months is one that's built around Bill Clinton's famous remark on inappropriate relationships. We haven't really defined what inappropriate relationships are, and might do that by saying what appropriateness means, which is quite an interesting question to focus on in relationships. But anyway, it seems to me that the extending of the range of relationship choices is going to continue. It's going to continue to intertwine relationships with everyday life practices. It's going to take us into uncharted species of relationships and test our theories and conceptualizations by tying them to increasingly difficult or even obscure types of relationships, intermingling relationship work and personal communication in many different ways. I hope that we don't just turn into what's known in the birding community as twitchers, which is people who go around looking for new species of birds that they haven't seen before, and just try to add them to the list. I think there's a risk that people do that in relationship research, as in other research. And it seems to me that one of the major developments that could occur is if we start making relationships into independent variables to a greater extent than we have done at the moment. It seems to me that some classic topics in interpersonal communication contain tacit assumptions about the underlying nature of the relationship between the participants in those other processes, or else they do not regard that relationship as problematic or worthy of attention within that particular framework. But between any pair of persons presumed in the abstract to be carrying on some interpersonal communication process, such as persuasion or group interaction, there can exist a relationship which ranges from close friendship to relatively distant social relationships between essentially interchangeable people. And to presume that the relationships between partners are unimportant in qualifying or modifying those other interpersonal processes seems to me to probably be a mistake at this point. A couple of exemplary possibilities as time ticks on will be attitude change and persuasion on the one hand, group dynamics in the other. We've often studied small group decision-making, even perhaps studied jury decision-making within our field, but very rarely looked at the relationships that get formed between people before they make those decisions. And it seems to me if you're going to be locked up for a number of months or weeks or however long, making decisions about O.J. Simpson or anybody else, you probably end up forming relationships with the people in the group. And the sorts of relationships that are formed within that previously zero history group might well influence the ethos that you carry when you're making persuasive arguments in the jury decision-making process. In fact, the Small Group Research Journal has just announced a call for papers on the relational side of groups, which is the first time I've ever seen that done. And they are offering a special issue focusing on social or interpersonal connections, ties or bonds formed among group members. And then going on to look at the way in which decision-making takes place as a result of that. So I was going to say some stuff about persuasion, but Sandra said most of that already. So one conclusion that I draw from this is that whereas in 1976 we recognized that everyday relationships were different sorts of communication from other forms of speech then studied, we now need to see that relational processes are probably not all that different from most other interpersonal communication. In fact, a relational dimension underlies most other interpersonal processes and should be explored as an influence on the pure operation of those other processes. The everyday processes that we somehow separate out for study are not really so separate from the relational processes that individuals experience as part of their everyday life. The two overlap. When Miller saw this as a symbiotic relationship between communication and relationship development, we can perhaps go beyond that and see a symbiotic relationship between all relational processes and all other forms of interpersonal communication. And as we look forward to the next 23 years, my guess is that we will make such things more central and more so.
Next presenter is going to be Mark Fine, who is housed in the Human Development and Family Studies Department. So not surprisingly, he's going to talk about possible or potential contributions from the Human Development and Family Studies perspective.
Thank you, John. Excuse me. I'm going to be talking about contributions from Human Development and Family Studies, which I will, fortunately for all of us, abbreviate as HDFS from now on. But I'm also going to talk about contributions from communication studies and other social sciences to HDFS. And I have a couple of examples from my own work that I'd like to share where I think that what I've seen from communication scholars has enriched the kind of work that I've done in the past. Human Development and Family Studies, I hesitate to call it discipline because we're really interdisciplinary. We have people who have PhDs in HDFS in our department, for example, at the University of Missouri. But we also have psychologists like myself, sociologists, we have people with degrees in education. So I'm not even sure exactly what the discipline would be if we would call HDFS a degree. But we study human development over the lifespan, we study child development, our roots were in child development, in fact. And we study family studies. It's an important part of our mission as a department. Before I get to some of the contributions from HDFS and to HDFS, a little bit about my background might help kind of illustrate the benefits that I see in the Human Development and Family Studies framework. I'm a clinical psychologist who always has believed deeply and been committed to interdisciplinary efforts. I moved from a psychology department to a Human Development and Family Studies department because of disenchantment with some of the disciplinary rigidity in psychology, because of the interdisciplinary nature of HDFS, and because of my interest in relationships and families. I've been much more comfortable in an HDFS environment than I was in a psychology environment. Sorry for those of you. I strongly resist traditional disciplinary boundaries to the point where I don't like to think about psychological research or sociological research. I like to think about social science research. And I realize that that's maybe a bit naive and idealistic. And there are certain benefits that come from each of us having our own disciplinary training in terms of unique methods and theories that we bring to bear on our topics. But in my ideal world, I don't know that we have separate kinds of departments dividing up social science. I also think we need to do a whole lot better job, including myself, of reading each other's work. I know that I'm guilty of that. I need to do a better job of reading communication scholars' work on families as well as sociologists' work. I think we all need to do that within the constraints of time, but it's certainly a problem for all of us. From my observations, and they're relatively recent observations about communication studies, I think that communication scholars can be of great help to HDFS researchers like myself in terms of assessing and understanding communication processes, conversations, micro-level kinds of processes that many of us at HDFS don't have a lot of expertise in. I've also felt that communication scholars bring to bear theoretical perspectives on relationships and families that are not commonly used among family scholars, from a dialectical perspective. We have a huge book that we often use in family studies, the source book of family theories. It's a longer thing, and it's 4 billion pages long. As far as I can tell, there's no chapter in there or any mention of dialectical perspective in there. And I found that perspective to be intriguing and informative as I think about my own work. Now, what can HDFS contribute to communications and other social sciences? And these are things that I like about HDFS, things that I'm attracted to. HDFS has the benefit of at least theoretically studying development over the entire lifespan. Now, we don't always do a great job of that, and our department, for example, does a better job at certain periods of lifespan than it does at others. But at least least theoretically, we all think about development as occurring over the course of an entire lifetime. HDFS, again, in theory, takes a contextual approach to understanding relationships, which I think most of us probably find appealing, but it's so much more a part of our being in HDFS than it certainly was when I was in a psychology club. And I greatly appreciate that, even though studying context brings with it a number of methodological problems that we're all very much aware of. It's difficult to study context and to measure. HDFS can serve as a model of interdisciplinary study. I was asking some people today whether a communications department would accept a faculty member, hire a faculty member without a communications PhD. And I got the question back to me, and it was a strange question because we don't even think about this when we hire. We don't hardly even look at the source of the PhD. We look at the articles and expertise and the methods the person's aware of and so forth. And we have people from all kinds of disciplines, and would hire people from English and American Studies if we felt that they would make a contribution to some gap in the department. So the interdisciplinary nature of our field, I think, is a really nice draw. HDFS scholarship has generated some theories that might be useful to folks outside of HDFS, such as Bronfenberg's ecological model, which is contextual and so forth. And, it's kind of a framework, I think, that a lot of HDFS research gets based on. Okay, two examples that I'll give, and then I'll sit down. I have done a fair amount of work on the step-parent role in the step families. I've used surveys, various types, extensive interviews, behavioral observations, of family interaction. But what's really missing from my work on the step-parent role is information on the process, how the role emerges. For example, in one study, my colleagues and I studied the extent to which consistency among step-family members in perceptions of the step-parent role were related to adjustment. In other words, how important was it that the mother and the stepfather agreed about how the stepfather should function as a step-parent in that family? How was that related to adjustment and so forth? And we have found that indeed there is a relationship between consistency and perception of the role and adjustment. But we don't have any idea of exactly what's going on in terms of conversation, discourse, and communication that leads to this kind of consistency in role perception. To what extent are they talking? Maybe they're not talking at all about the role, but they just kind of have a similar set of beliefs based on cultural things that they see. Or maybe they literally are having discussions and talking. And I would really like to enrich the work that I've done by looking at conversations that step-family members make, usually step-parents and parents, and seeing how they negotiate the role and to what extent they really explicitly do so. And I don't know that I have the expertise to do that, but I think that's a fruitful ground for collaboration with communication scholars. Another example, I have also done work on processes related to relationship stability, defined kind of narrowly as whether relationships stay together or whether relationships terminate. And my work has mostly been guided by the investment model, which looks at certain kinds of cognitions related to commitment, relationship satisfaction, relationship alternatives, and investments. And I'm also kind of intrigued by one group that's been identified are folks who are in stable marriages, meaning that the members of the couple don't think very often about splitting up and divorcing, but they report being dissatisfied. So they've been called unhappy but stable couples. And I think I've kind of gotten to the limit of what I can understand about those folks without doing some more qualitative kinds of work to get at the meanings that they assign to various aspects of their relationship. And I also think that that's a perfect place perhaps for a dialectical perspective to dig in and to look at the push and pull that goes on in these folks' lives between staying together and not staying together and why they made the choice to stay together. But I haven't seen anybody in HDFS or psychology or sociology who has looked at the tensions involved in that process of deciding whether to stay together or not. And it's another fruitful ground for potential collaboration. Thank you.
And now from the hopelessly rigid discipline of psychology, Linda Acitelli is going to talk about our communicating and relating synonymous. I'm sure she'll
So the title is Communicating and Relating Synonymous. And I like this title, and other people told me they like this title, and I just hope it doesn't turn out to be the best part of the talk. When I began to really think seriously about this talk and this question and this communication, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So, when I was asked to speak about how the study of relationships became such a major area in interpersonal communication at a communication conference, no less, I was intrigued, a little frightened. But first I thought, isn't the answer obvious? But often when I ask that question, the answer is no. So it became a challenge for me to figure out how to answer this question. And then I also wondered why John invited me, a relative outsider, a social psychologist. And then I thought maybe it was because I was an outsider. Because maybe as an outsider who knows less about all of the ramifications of interpersonal communication, I can make generalizations that insiders dare not make. So, in looking back to see how the study of relationships became a major topic in communication studies, I cannot take a grand historical perspective, as Sandra and Steve did, as someone inside the field canine, but merely a theoretical, practical, and a personal historical perspective. And in addition, another goal of the panel, as has been brought up, is to look forward, possible new directions for the field. So the latter part of this talk will also take a look forward in terms of the relationship between the interpersonal communication and social psychology fields. So I responded to the first question of how relationships became a major goal with more general questions. And they are, as relating and communicating seem to be ubiquitous and inextricably linked social phenomena, are they interchangeable? What is the process of communicating if it is not the process of relating? Acitelli, even and Jackson have said that in every communication there is an implicit relational message. They have also said that you cannot not communicate. So if every communication has an implicit relational message and one cannot not communicate, does it also follow that you cannot not relate? If so, speaking theoretically, barring the whims and politics of individuals, it then follows that relating would inevitably become a dominant focus of inquiry within interpersonal communication. So if we can suspend this belief and withhold all of the complexities of what communication means to a communication scholar, and accept the topic of that interpersonal communication is the topic of relating, then we can see how research in communication studies may have evolved from studying communication in interactions to studying relationships. Relationships becoming a dominant focus of inquiry within interpersonal communication seems to me to be inevitable. But the qualifier is, to me, seems to me to be inevitable. So I think it's important that you understand my frame of reference, just as Martin gave you his frame of reference. I come to you as an outsider, someone who knows just a little about interpersonal communication, from the viewpoint of a bewildered psychologist who is trying to study talk in and about relationships. Why bewildered? It probably goes back much earlier, maybe to my early childhood, but to keep the talk short, I'll start in 1984. How about that? When I was a grad student in psychology, and for my prelims, or I guess some of you may call them comps, I wrote a lit review on the concept of psychological intimacy. From that, I found there were not only different definitions of intimacy, but different components of loving each other and knowing each other in their various forms. But I also noticed what was missing from the picture. The studies on intimacy to that date were ignoring or omitting the couple's attention toward or perspectives on their own relationships as a component of intimacy. Something that some of you may have heard labeled relationship awareness or attending to the relationship. So as the thought of my dissertation loomed ahead of me, I wondered how in the world am I going to get an empirical study out of that topic? So I surmised that thinking and talking about relationships would be manifestations of attention toward and indications of perspectives about relationships. So I thought, sure, I'll do a study on that. Imagine my surprise as an idealistic graduate student when I found nothing on talking about relationships, let alone thinking about them, in the psychology literature. Where did I find it? In the communication literature. So, did I think it was a bold move to branch into another discipline? Not at all. I didn't know enough to know that we as psychologists were supposed to be narrowly focused, or some may say narrow-minded, and look at the world through disciplinary eyes. I didn't know that. So I didn't. And I still consider that lucky in spite of the grief it causes me in my own field. But my goal was to do the best study I could with the supporting literature that was out there, regardless of where it came from. So I did. And obviously, well, maybe not so obviously, but the work of Leslie Baxter, Steve Duck, Bob Martin, and Roz Burnett helped me tremendously shaping my thinking about relationship talk. And Roz Burnett is a social psychologist in the UK, and some of you may be familiar with her 1986 book, Accounting for Relationships. But back in 1984, the only way I knew of her work was from a fellow grad student who had gone to a relationship conference in Madison in 1984 and had a copy of some of her handouts from the talk. And that's how rare the research was on this topic and how hard it was for me to find it. And this story is merely to illustrate how difficult it was to find anyone in psychology who was doing work in the area I wanted to study, which I believe was at the theoretical heart of social psychology, but not the political, popular, or current heart of social psychology. So, my first exposure to communication research was through the field of personal relationships. So in my mind, they naturally go together. Currently, the field of close relationships is becoming more recognized as a topic in social psychology, but is seen as marginal social psychology rather than central. For example, in 1995, in a paper in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, social psychologists Leonard Berkowitz and Patricia Devine wrote a paper entitled, "Has Social Psychology Always Been Cognitive? What is cognitive anyhow?" So in lamenting the cognitive and less social nature of social psychology, Berkowitz and Devine write, "Studies of how people acted toward each other in their interpersonal relationships were an important part of our field in prior decades. But now this area seems to have been left almost entirely to departments of communication." End quote. I'm not sure who they alienate more by that statement. Departments of communication or social psychologists who study relationships. But I do know it upset plenty of social psychologists. Nevertheless, Berkowitz and Devine then go on to demonstrate how such fields as the study of prejudice and intergroup tension, which are fundamentally interpersonal phenomena, are investigated as intrapersonal phenomena, as Steve alluded to earlier. In other words, they're studying these as what is going on in the head of one person, the attitudes and beliefs. And they give as their example the fact that their methods often presume that the targets of prejudice are passive elicitors of prejudice, without focusing attention on the nature of the reciprocal dynamic between majority and minority group members as they encounter one another. And this point isn't unlike the point that Bill Ickes makes in his chapter in the book entitled, "What's So Social About Social Cognition?" And that most of us in social psychology do not study truly social phenomena when we have participants interact with lists of words, visual images, computers, or written stories, or even people, but the people are often strangers and confederates of the investigator. So what do Berkowitz and Devine suggest that we as social psychologists do to rectify this problem of being too narrowly cognitive and intrapersonal? They suggest we become, quote, more aware of the conceptual commonalities between some of our predecessors' theoretical formulations and present-day cognitively oriented theorizing, in not regarding the earlier theoretical approach as entirely different from their own analyses. Contemporary social psychologists might be more open to the social psychological research of prior generations than they currently appear to be. At the very least, message disconcerting. Note that they acknowledge that much of the work on interpersonal relationships is being done in communication departments. But dare they suggest that we might rectify the problem or even learn a thing or two by studying the communication literature? No, they suggest becoming even more entrenched in social psychology. Why is that? Why don't most social psychologists allow themselves to cross disciplinary boundaries? That's also Martha's question earlier. At the same time that this paper came out, 1995, one of mine came out in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships entitled Disciplines That Parallel Play, where I argued that the field of personal relationships claims to be interdisciplinary, but it's really multidisciplinary. And being interdisciplinary requires researchers to integrate different perspectives on the same problem from more than one discipline, whereas being multidisciplinary requires only that researchers representing different disciplines be brought together and work on separate problems relevant to their own discipline. But in this paper, I also demonstrated that communication scholars are much more likely to cite psychologists than psychologists are to cite communication scholars. So does that really matter? And why should anyone care about this issue? Why is it so important that we aim to loosen disciplinary boundaries? Well, if it's correct to assume that interdisciplinary work often leads to creativity, then rigid disciplinary boundaries inhibit creativity. Major advances in any field are often creative and often do not fit into any established discipline, yet can be recognized across disciplines. Often such an advance is eventually embraced by two or more disciplines because it makes sense from disparate observations. For example, Freud was a neurologist and a physician who formulated the revolutionary theory that a person's physical symptoms could originate from the person's ideas. And his work eventually had tremendous influence in the literary world, psychology, and many other disciplines. And putting all the weaknesses and political incorrectness of Freud's theory aside for the moment, do you think if he stayed within his own disciplinary boundaries, he would have made such an impact on the world? Perhaps some of you wish he hadn't, but I'm merely trying to illustrate how limiting it is to be tied to disciplinary boundaries and how freeing it can be to one's creativity to loosen them up. So in looking forward, I recommend that instead of creating separate pieces of a picture from different disciplines and then putting the pieces together into a composite picture, that researchers might gain from talking to one another before the pieces are ever constructed. Perhaps several methods could be used to study the same phenomena, or new methods could emerge from such talk. We could take a pragmatic rather than a discipline-oriented approach to research on personal relationships. We could ask ourselves, what kinds of data do we need to answer the research question, and what are the best ways of gathering them instead of a total immersion in a disciplinary worldview? Philip Birnbaum has analyzed data from a stratified sample of 84 interdisciplinary research projects. He himself has also conducted several studies on the practice of interdisciplinary research. And his findings, quote, indicate that interdisciplinary research is most useful during the initiating and implementing stages, when comprehensiveness is important in identifying the problem, gathering the data, and analyzing the data. Interdisciplinary research activity is much less useful when conclusions are being drawn. So, if we are striving for disciplinary integration, we must, in essence, learn to see again. And one barrier that blinds us from seeing through disciplinary boundaries might be the nature of the standards for evaluation of our work. What works in one discipline may not work in another. Or some disciplines may not even agree that the extent to which the question of what works even matters. Thus, as disciplines differ in the extent to which they evaluate their work, some disciplines may devalue the work of the other disciplines. And I hate to say that some social psychologists have an elitist attitude about their own work, but it's difficult to avoid that conclusion. But I also have to add, it's probably true in every discipline. Maybe one reason the biological sciences are so readily interdisciplinary could be that the various disciplines within the biological fields, such as biochemistry and physiology, they have the same criteria for evaluating their research. Thus, understanding the different evaluative standards and fostering respect for one another's work may be the necessary first steps in crossing boundaries between disciplines. As researchers from different disciplines, we see each other regularly at conferences, and some of us may have pleasant personal relationships with one another. But it's time to have working relationships with each other. It's time for communication scholars and social psychologists to graduate from parallel to interactive play. And we could start by recognizing that communicating and relating are not only synonymous, but that the act of recognition could be the theoretical key to unlocking the disciplinary doors. Thank you.
Okay, we do have some time for some questions, so we can just open it up to, or if anyone wants to respond to any of the other panelists, that would be fine too. Or comments, doesn't have to be questions.
Running the camera here at the same time. I have a student in my interpersonal communication class that is a psychology, is majoring in psychology, and he is really struggling with this whole issue. Many times when we talk about interpersonal communication issues and theories and ideas, he wants to draw this very definite line between them, and I have to continue to go back and say, this, he'll say, well, I don't know if it's that way in psychology. Well, but if we can look at these, they're very similar, and we can see that there's some crossover. Is there any kind of suggestions that you can have to help me out with helping the student struggle with his problem here, crossing those lines?
Well, when you said, I don't know if it's that way in psychology, did you ever ask him, does that matter, or does,
Well,
because, I made that point about if you want to find out what's happening or solve a certain problem, does it matter which discipline you go through as long as you can find the best answer you can find? It is hard. I know it's hard to do that.
well, I don't think he would be probably very responsive to that. He's pretty,
Yeah, like
he gets
doesn't matter.
pretty upset sometimes about, making the distinctions between the two and trying to make his own distinctions between the two as he tries to learn. He's trying to separate them when I say it would be, right, when I say, it would be much easier probably just to understand these concepts if he would see that they can complement each other.
Yes, I agree with that, but that's difficult when someone their goal is to separate them. I wish I could help you answer that.
I think you should tell him to become a cognitive psychologist.
And then you won't have to worry.
You won't have to worry about it,
Right.
exactly.
Don't bother with relationships then. But yeah, that's a really tough one.
There's a question up here.
One of the issues that was part of the discussion, although it seemed more embedded than maybe we wanted it to be, was to look at some of the future directions and issues in interpersonal communication and personal relationships. Where is it that we're really going to take these ideas? So now we have a little bit of an idea of what the historical issues are, the interdisciplinary issues are, but what is the future of our thinking about personal relationships? Now, as a panel members, but I also like to know what people, there are lots of interpersonal scholars and group scholars in the audience that I'd like to hear from too. Yeah, where's our future?
So anybody feel free to speak up.
evaluation standards that you mentioned is taking seriously the interactive and emergent nature of relationships. And, you know, I'm sorry, Mark, you know, you're thinking about needing, this idea of needing to maybe start to look at the dynamics of communication to see how those perceptions emerge. My experience in working with people, particularly in psychology, is when you get into that dynamic, the kind of complexity of coding and inferential activity that's necessary. I mean, I'm not talking about loose, I mean, the qualitative, just how to, not when you code it, just to even try to get at it structurally, runs afoul of a lot of the very tight, rigorous experimental methodologies of psychology. I mean, my experience with psychologists, colleagues, is they're all very interested in this. And when you talk about it, that's intriguing. Well, how do you get at that? And then you start talking about interpretive coding systems and iterator reliabilities and studying the logical structure of arguments and all that, and they kind of glaze over. It's kind of like, how in the world do I translate that into something that, according to the evaluation standards of a rigorous kind of experimental psychology, would pass muster? And so I think that idea of a differential evaluation structure is a real issue. Another thing I would point out, I don't think it's so much intellectual as structural in terms of our reward system. I think if we're going to see the kind of interdisciplinary work that you were talking about, we have to create rewards for that happening. And I'm sorry, but it probably has to be more than simply answering questions better. One of the great forces for interdisciplinary work in higher education today is grants. I mean, you want to see biologists, communication scholars, psychologists work together. Let NIH send out an RFP for a multi-million-dollar grant program that demand that kind of integrative approach for the physiological, cognitive, and interactive parts of public health issues. You will find interdisciplinary work because they're going to have millions of dollars of research. Now, I'm not trying to be too mercenary here, but I think we've got to find within higher education, this is an issue that goes beyond intellectual barriers. We have to find structures within our institutions that reward more fruitfully that kind of work. Because in some ways, we're working against a reward structure within the disciplines. I mean, there's definitely a reward structure for building your career inside your discipline. And how do we create some other reward structure, either institutionally or otherwise, that actually rewards the kind of thinking that I think all of you all were encouraging. So I think there's two barriers there that I think. One is the different evaluation structures in that one case, and the other is a lack of a reward structure for people who are interested in fact, there are costs more than rewards, as you can see.
I also think though about the grant system, though, it seems like it is shifting more toward being broader. And yes, and wanting something that's not as narrowly focused on one discipline so that it can apply to, you know, society's problems, and you can't just do that within one discipline. And they encourage interdisciplinary, at least the ones
That's what I'm saying. That's been one of the great forces in higher education. Now they use the word transdisciplinary.
Yeah, right.
I mean, these agencies won't problem solve, and they understand more and more that it takes some integration, usually of some physiological, biological, cognitive, communicative team that's going to take all the dimensions in, and that is a great resource. But we need more of that if we're going to have the kind of integrated work flow.
Well, what about some ideas? I mean, ideas of research that we might.
Well, I hope that all the interpersonal communication stuff starts to, maybe continues, but hopefully more so, connect with people's lives instead of such mess as a method and disciplinary issues and stuff like that. I hope the research really actually tries to connect with people's lives. Could probably start with connecting with our own lives, also probably being aware of the impact of what we do upon our students and their lives, take it very, very seriously. Maybe go from there to what happens in the larger society. Maybe deal with real problems, real concerns, as opposed to theoretical stuff. Second thing, I want to ask you, Professor Acitelli, I thought your talk rocked until the end. And then I was really wondering, it sounded like you were rehearsing the dream of the unity of science once again. I mean, I've been working with a soils professor from Sweden, and
I didn't understand. I didn't understand rehearsing
the dream of the unity of science. I mean, I've been working with a soils professor from Sweden, and he can pour acid on rocks, you know, anywhere and find out if they bubble. And, Paul Simon's already told us cars are cars all over the world, but people differ in very, very significant ways. Why would agreeing on method help us in any way in dealing with that?
Agreeing on method?
Yeah, I thought you were saying,
Oh.
and that's, I fundamentally misunderstood you, then take me down, because I really liked your talk, except for that.
We can talk about this a lot. I don't necessarily think we agree, like one person has a method and the other one has to agree with the other one, but that either multiple methods or come up with a new method together. So I wasn't necessarily saying that one person has to say, oh, I'm going to agree with your method. But first you have to, I think the respect needs to be there, that we need to respect each other's methods in order to talk about how we can come up with a new one, or say, let's use both to look at the same thing. Does that help?
I like to talk very much. I guess I just don't agree. I think we need to focus on people more than method.
Be more.
People more than method. I think method's a distraction
But
that's
then
got us.
how do you, okay, is there, well, maybe I should ask, there's a means of looking at people? What do you, when you say we focus on people, how do you do it?
Conversation, listening.
So maybe we're just speaking a different language, because conversation and listening to me would be a method.
Okay.
Looking at people.
Okay. I liked your pragmatist point, because the pragmatist would have a little impatience with method as a solution.
I appreciate it. I so appreciate that when Mark took over as the editor of Journal of Social and Personal Relationships, we sat down and he tell me about your journals, tell me about your discipline, and I was so impressed, and I still love with Mark's approach. And I think maybe Mark's idea, and maybe it's connected to people, as you're talking about, is what are the problems? What are we researching? There's much of us doing research in step families right now. And your work is so informed ours, and I've appreciated that our work is informing yours. And I think it's through, and maybe it won't happen so much at this kind of conference as it will at interdisciplinary conferences like INPR, where we can have a panel together and then talk about those issues together. Then I think there's also the issue of follow-through, where we really read those literatures and we go, well, people really do that. So that's kind of the challenge, is getting people. I think it's easier to do it at a conference, say, oh, what a great connection.
Yeah.
Than go home and say, gosh, I really have to pull out that literature and read it. I have to get it into my bibliography on my computer now. It's so easy to go back. Mark has said that, if you're right, it's easy to go back to what's already there, just pull out sites. So I think maybe connecting to people is connecting around problems people or issues people have, and then coming at those in those sort of disciplinary ways. I think we're starting in some really exciting ways. And some of the people sitting, those four people represent people that are doing this very well.
You've been trying to get through for a while, haven't you?
Yeah, actually, I think there are structures that are in place. Some of these things happen sort of serendipitously. I have a good example at my university. We just reorganized our general education, which usually is a terrible, awful, horrible thing. People go crazy in. But they forced us into an upper division cluster sort of framework. And one of the professors in criminal justice decided he wanted to look around campus and find everybody who was looking at children, and found 10 people, including myself, who all were on the same campus for over a decade in different buildings that never talked to one another. And so he forced us into this cluster circle, and they've been some of the most exciting meetings I've ever been to. We're all very passionate about children and children's interests, and we've done some community activist work. There's been groups that have developed. We have a film and video week that's coming up about children, where we've gotten all kinds of people involved. Mr. Rogers, people are coming, the Blues Clues people are coming to our campus, and it's been very, very invigorating and exciting. But it's what the center is, we all care a lot about kids, and we're all starting to look at, we don't want them to go to jail from the criminal justice side. There's a developmental psychologist, there's a person from education, there's a person who teaches a children's literature class, I teach a children's communication class, we've got a sociologist. So it's been very exciting to see, but the core that binds us, we all care deeply about kids. And I mean, I over the years, going to meetings hasn't been that exciting, but these are really great. I really enjoyed eating lunch with these people and sharing thoughts with them. But it was more out of pain and suffering of general education that brought us together.
How can it happen without that kind of structure? How can we make that happen without that sort of structure of children?
Yeah. Well, Sam Becker once said we all should go hang out in the football stadium at the beginning of an academic year and decide who you want to hang out with for the year, and then go hang out with them. I thought that was a neat idea, too.
I defer to Steve Cullen.
I wanted to kind of reinforce something that Steve talked about, and maybe
reference to something Melinda talked about as well. In 1978 to 82, somewhere in that ballpark, it was certainly possible to study at the graduate level interpersonal communication and have virtually no interest in personal relationships. I think when I came out of graduate school, I had very little. They began to take on appreciated significance in my personal life. And my interest in persuasion, influence, etc., as I became a parent, for example, I began to find fascinating places in which to study interactively influence. And in interactions and episodes that in a short and a long-term sense had real consequences. And so I've really enjoyed the increased emphasis on close relationships as it's happened. I worry a little bit. I also have found it useful that I knew something about compliance gaining, persuasion, and social influence as these interests have emerged. And I think the idea about looking at relational development with a variety of other functions, or I don't even know the right language, but the way it's played out in my own work is looking at parenting, parent-child interaction, regulation, and some consequences of those types of episodes. And it's helped to learn something more about close relationships, and it's helped to know something about persuasion and social influence. I'd like to see more melding like that, as opposed to viewing, you either do one or the other.
What I found interesting in looking at some of this historical development is that I think early on, interpersonal communication was always considered the one points. I mean, it was almost without real context. It didn't matter really what you did, but you were interpersonal, so therefore you were quantoid, and therefore that's what you did. It's interesting to look at that because what emerged was when you look at the content, there was a lot of research on compliance gaining and a lot of research on in the 70s. Then we had people arguing that there was really no framework, that we were doing this stuff, we didn't really have, that's why Miller wrote that, the between people, because we didn't really have anything that we could call interpersonal communication with any clear vision. And as we started moving into trying to think about how it is we're going to define the nature of interpersonal communication, we began to move more and more to have, in a sense, two different directions. One that kept the social influence idea, and the other where we emerged and had the personal relationship emphasis. And what we see now, and that lasted for probably a decade or two, and what we see now, though, is this blending, bringing back, because it gives it context, like the organizational people and the health people, where we can say we do this within the context of personal relationships. And now we're looking at social influence within the context of personal relationships, and the blending of those two directions are now being brought together under the auspices of personal relationships, where interpersonal communication had those things held apart. So I think that it's very important for us to see this kind of movement where initially we had these little teeny threads historically in the 1900s of things that people were kind of doing, sort of like interpersonal communication, sort of interested in issues of expression, sort of attitudes, sort of this, sort of that. And it helped us to lay the groundwork for that, to that movement, to the two directions, and now the blending of those things into something that has much more substance than it ever did before in interpersonal communication.
Well, why don't we do one more quick question? But I don't know if anybody else noticed when we do the scheduling lecture, this is supposed to end at 5, and the business meeting is supposed to start at 5. So we should probably make one more quick question.
1 minute, yes. I hope that as a field we'll continue to take seriously setting dyads in larger contexts. In particular, what's interesting to me is political institutions and ideologies. the notion of public happiness is a good old 18th century term that got plugged into our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And there is a big umbrella culturally, in this country at least, in which, under which we live, and I can't help but think intuitively there are connections there, political institutions and ideologies. The second one is, as the culture continues to fragment, how do we create community is going to be a number one issue and maybe a life and death issue for many people in the next several decades. And so I think we continue to need to look at community and community making and how that is